This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our 5th Annual Defence and Security Studies Conference took place on April 20th, this year virtually. The theme this year was Climate Change Impacts on National Security and Beyond. Our participants were Jonathan Quinn, David Harries, Michael Rula, and John Conger. Jonathan Quinn and David Harries, moderated by Dan Eustace, led off session 1 of the afternoon.
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be viewing from. I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace, Director of the RCMI Defense and Security Studies Program, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Royal Canadian Military Institute Annual Defense and Security Studies Conference entitled Climate Change, Impacts on Canadian National Security and Beyond. While we have been holding virtual speaker events throughout the last year, today's event represents our first virtual annual conference, and quite frankly, I hope the last. The focus of our conference today is climate change and the implications for Canadian national security in all of its facets, as well as implications and challenges posed by climate change on the international security scene more broadly. In order to address these complex issues, we are fortunate to have 4 leading experts in this field with us today, and they will be introduced to you in due course. So if there are any other issues that pop up during the course of this event, please, you can use the chat function to contact myself, and we'll sort out any issues that you may have, but hopefully that will not be the case. So with that, let me get started now by introducing Dr. Michael Hoare. Dr. Hoare is the president of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, and he would like to bring you greetings. Dr. Hoare.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 5th Annual Defense and Security Studies Conference presented by the Royal Canadian Military Institute. This is the first time we've conducted the conference electronically in virtual form, but we've gained significant experience over the past pandemic year in presenting many virtual events. It has been a challenging year, of course, in pursuing the educational mandate of the Institute, but we've learned and adapted to this new situation. One of the positive outcomes of our venture into the virtual world has been the much wider audience of members and the public who've been able to access these events regardless of their location. I'm told that today we have many individuals attending the conference, and I thank you all for your ongoing support. When Dr. Dan Eustace proposed the conference on climate change and its impacts on national security and beyond, I was immediately supportive, as I'd recently done some reading about the relationship between climate change and armed conflict in various parts of the planet. Climate change presents a serious threat to the security and prosperity of countries. Domestically, the effects of climate change could overwhelm disaster response capabilities through the destabilizing effect of storms, droughts, floods, and fires. Internationally, climate change may cause humanitarian disasters, contribute to political violence, and undermine weak governments. We're fortunate today to have with us 4 very knowledgeable speakers on this subject. John Conger from the United States is Director of the Center for Climate and Security. David Harries from Canada is Principal, the Security and Sustainability Guide. Jonathan Quinn, also from Canada, is Director General for Continental Defense Policy, Department of National Defense. And joining us later in the conference, speaking from Brussels, Belgium, we are very fortunate to have Michael Rula from NATO, Head of the Hybrid Challenges and Energy Security Section, Emerging Security Challenges Division. Many thanks to all of you for your participation in this conference. Let me conclude my thanks by recognizing the significant efforts of our Director of Defense and Security Studies program, Dr. Dan Eustace, in organizing what is guaranteed to be a most stimulating and informative conference. And a special thanks to Sylvia Lau for handling the technology for this conference. So at this moment in the program, it's my task to introduce you to our conference sponsor, Maxis Staffing and Consulting. With us is Brian Berlotte, the chairman and CEO of Maxis Staffing and Consulting. Brian is a member of the Royal Canadian Military Institute and has served on our board, former officer, and is currently Colonel Governor General of the Guards. Maxis is one of the largest veteran-owned companies in Canada. It is also one of the country's largest staffing recruitment firms with 14 offices coast to coast. We very much appreciate the financial support that Maxis has provided for this conference. Now, allow me to give Brian a chance to say a few words. Welcome once again, and thank you for your support.
Mike, thank you very much. Very kind of you for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. It's indeed a great pleasure for us, Maxis, to be here today and to support this very important and timely conference. We very much appreciate the opportunity to support the RCMI on many different endeavors, especially this one, and especially on a topic that is at the forefront for many Canadians across the country from coast to coast. As you know, we do employ, as you pointed out, over 1,000 veterans and active reservists every year in active employment, either in the staffing function or consulting function. And the RCMI being so close to the military community, it's very much a pleasure for us to be here. So thanks again. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Dan.
Brian, thanks very much for that. We definitely appreciate all the support you provide the RCMI, and we're particularly happy that you could be the sponsor for our conference here today. So that's well done. Thanks again. And Dr. Mike, thanks for your opening remarks. Very much appreciated. So at this point in time, it's my pleasure to introduce our first two speakers, Jonathan Quinn and David Harries. David will speak immediately following Jonathan, and then I'll moderate the first question and answer session. But let me please introduce both of these gentlemen to you. So Jonathan Quinn is the Director General for Continental Defense Policy at the Department of National Defense. This new division within the Assistant Deputy Minister Policy Group is responsible for strategic policy development in the areas of continental and Arctic defense, NORAD modernization, and the military use of cyber, space, and other emerging capabilities. Jonathan has held a number of positions in the defense and security field since joining the public service in 2005. Among other assignments, he served as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Minister of National Defense, Director of Policy Development, and Deputy Director of Cabinet Liaison at the Department of National Defense. He was Counselor for Defense and Security at Canada's Permanent Mission at the Privy Council Office. Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York, and as an analyst at the Foreign and Defense Policy Secretariat at the Privy Council Office. My apologies. Jonathan brings a great deal of experience from the Canadian Department of National Defense today. Let me then turn to David Harries. David Harries will speak immediately after Jonathan. And as Mike Orr indicated, David is Principal of Security and Sustainability Guide. Now, David was a senior engineer officer in the Canadian Forces, and he served on multiple domestic and international operations and in professional military development as Deputy Commandant and Director of Curriculum at the National Defense College. His post-military consulting work has included providing services in personal and corporate security and security foresight at home and abroad, as well as being a senior advisor and a professor in heavy engineering, humanitarian aid, post-conflict, post-disaster response and recovery, civil military relations, international executive development, postgraduate university education. Now, David holds a number of senior positions, including Principal of the Security and Sustainability Guide, as I mentioned, a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science. He's past chair of Canadian Pugwash. He's Foresight Director at Idea Connect. And very importantly, he's the assistant coach of the varsity men's rugby union team at the Royal Military College of Canada. So quite an eclectic and background and a great deal of experience that David brings with him as well today. So with that, I would now like to turn first to Jonathan Quinn. And Jonathan, we look very much forward to hearing from you now.
Much for that nice introduction, and maybe I'll start off with a quick apology. I feel a little underdressed with all of you sharp people here. I tend not to wear the suit and tie when I'm working from home, so sorry, I'm looking a little more casual today, but it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's as others have said, it's a really important topic, so I'm eager to share kind of the latest thinking on this from a national defense perspective. So as has been mentioned, part of my team deals with climate change and particularly the defense and security implications of climate change. So this is obviously a cross-cutting issue that intersects with many defense and national security issues, both at home and abroad. And also, as many of you can appreciate, the security implications of climate change are multifaceted, complex, and many organizations across the defense team are engaged on this issue. Clearly, there's all kinds of really good work that's going on at national defense across the board, but until recently, it's largely been happening in silos. So within the policy group at National Defense, where I work as a Director General, the file had been a bit of an orphan, frankly. It had been passed around a little bit, and it was just very recently when the division that I lead was stood up just a little bit over a year ago, that it found kind of a more permanent home within the policy group. So the idea on our side is to sort of try to work to bring the various threads of this issue from practical considerations to more strategic together in a more deliberate way, so that we can start kind of participating in events like this to spread the word a little bit about some of the good work that we're doing, but also to talk about some of the challenges we're facing and the direction we think we need to head. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll try to keep my remarks fairly short and leave lots of time for questions. I'll provide a brief overview of the key implications of climate change for national defense from our perspective, a sense of the government's overarching policy objectives with respect to climate change writ large, and what they mean for us as a department and as a military. And I'll also outline some of the progress that we're making and have made to date, but also a bit of a sense of where we think we need to go. So first, a bit of background. The Government of Canada very clearly, as others in their opening remarks have mentioned, sees climate change as a real defining issue of our time, and one that has significant impacts across the economy, ecosystem, society, the security community, and more. And as the alarming pace of global warming continues to accelerate, the need for militaries and governments to adapt, to build stronger resilience and mitigate the environmental impacts of climate change, all while supporting responding to the increases in climate-related disasters, calls for some increasingly urgent action. So the effects of climate change are profound and evident for everybody at this point. Canada is warming at a rate that is roughly double the global average, with the Arctic suffering even more acutely, or experiencing climate change even more acutely, warming at about 3 times the global rate. So in the north, in particular, snow and ice cover are decreasing, glaciers are melting, and the permafrost is thawing. This means reduced ice cover, thawing permafrost are affecting economic development and traditional ways of life through problems associated with major coastal erosion and sliding terrain. This not only impacts the health and well-being of Northerners, but also makes infrastructure maintenance and construction more complex, including for national defense, which has a fairly significant footprint in the north. Further south, in our more southern latitudes, we have a different series of growing climate-related struggles, such as rising sea levels, which are presenting risks of permanent flooding for low-lying coastal areas. Vector-borne illnesses are migrating northwards and increasing the prominence of diseases such as Lyme disease, for example. Variations in precipitation patterns are increasing the frequency and magnitude of flooding, drought, and wildfires across the country. Such climate-related impacts are obviously not exclusive to Canada. Many countries have begun experiencing quite severe challenges. Storm surges, heat waves, prolonged droughts, extensive rainfall are just some of the climate change-driven impacts that can generate regional existential crises and exacerbate underlying social problems, creating environments of water and food insecurity, economic disruption, and migration. To date, climate change has often been somewhat of a silent partner in some of these crises, acting as a threat multiplier. So what does all this mean for the Department of National Defence and for the Canadian Armed Forces? Well, from an expeditionary perspective, global warming, sea level rise, rapid changes in precipitation patterns, and the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events are contributing directly to global insecurity. So it can lead to competition over scarce resources, drive migration, creating climate refugees, all of which can either create, in some cases, or at the very least exacerbate existing underlying state fragility and lead to regional and even broader tensions. It can also lead to more frequent, or it is leading to more frequent and severe weather events, both of which, global instability and severe natural disasters, can increase the demand for Canadian Armed Forces operations abroad, whether peace building, peace support operations, or disaster assistance operations. And here at home, it's clear that climate change is significantly increasing the demand for the Canadian Armed Forces to help respond to natural disasters, which clearly puts pressure on efforts to generate forces for our other core missions. And while it's true that the Canadian Armed Forces, the military, are intended to be a force of last resort for these kinds of disasters and responding to these kinds of disasters, we're finding that while that's true, we're increasingly the force of first choice for many communities, and the requests for assistance are, as I said, increasing significantly. Beyond operational considerations, national defense and the Canadian Armed Forces have a responsibility to do its part to reduce emissions. And the changing climate is also, the changing climate is, lost my space here. Changing climate is also testing the resilience of critical military infrastructure, particularly in the north, where, as I said, permafrost degradation is a significant issue in terms of northern infrastructure. So climate change, in our eyes, therefore necessitates a really comprehensive response that adapts infrastructure, training, security environment forecasting, equipment and operations to meet a rapidly changing natural environment. Our efforts to anticipate the security implications of climate change, adapt our forces to meet these security challenges, and implement solutions to mitigate the impact of climate change are all inextricably linked. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the north, in Canada's Arctic, where the changing physical environment is altering the geostrategic environment, leading some of our key competitors to pursue national agendas in that region that may conflict with Canadian interests. So the Arctic will require careful coordination and concerted effort among our close partners to ensure the region's future safety and prosperity in the context of this rapidly changing environment. So as mentioned, addressing climate change has been a central tenet of the current government's broader policy agenda since it was first elected in 2015. They've made it clear that fighting climate change is the responsibility of every department and agency across the federal government. All ministers of the Crown have been tasked through their respective mandate letters from the Prime Minister to address climate change and contribute to the government's overall strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect the environment, and ideally to do so in a way that will grow the economy as well. Specifically, the Prime Minister's January 2021 supplementary mandate letters to all ministers, including the Minister of National Defense, says, and I quote, I expect you and all ministers to pursue complementary partnerships and initiatives that will support our work to exceed our emissions reduction target, seize new market opportunities to create good jobs, and prepare our country to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate. And guiding the government's efforts is a pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, or PCF. And this represents the Government of Canada's plan to meet national emissions reduction targets, grow the economy, and build resilience to a changing climate. While the national security risks posed by climate change are not explicitly addressed in the PCF, the government has, as I mentioned, provided clear direction that every department is responsible to do their part in adapting to climate change. Clear government direction is also articulated in the Treasury Board Secretariat's Greening Government Strategy, which lays out a framework to help the Government of Canada reach its commitment of net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. As the largest contributor to federal greenhouse gas emissions, national targets can't be met without innovative and bold efforts by national defense to reduce its own emissions. And for our part, at National Defense, our guiding policy document, Strong, Secure, Engaged, did recognize the central role that the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces must play in contributing to the Government of Canada's objectives. This includes the commitment to reduce DND-CAF's greenhouse gas emissions for infrastructure and non-operational vehicle fleets by 40% between 2005 and 2030. Further, the policy commits the Canadian Armed Forces to work with allies, partners, and the broader international community to address common security challenges like those posed by climate change. As well, more specifically, the Prime Minister's 2019 mandate letter to the Minister of National Defence called on DND-CAF to expand Canadian defence cooperation and training assistance by drawing on the expertise of the Canadian Armed Forces to help other countries that are at greater risk of disasters due to climate change. We're in the process now of exploring opportunities to realize this commitment. So the Department of National Defence and Canadian Armed Forces have been very active in starting to deliver on these commitments. Last year, 100% of new and upgraded defence buildings were built to meet the latest industry standards of excellence in green building design, construction, and maintenance. In addition, 75% of all electricity used at bases and wings in provinces with carbon-intensive electrical grids came from clean sources, and 27% of our light-duty vehicle fleet now runs on hybrid or electric technology. DND is developing an adaptation risk assessment framework to further assess DND programs and critical infrastructure. This risk assessment will help prioritize the adaptation of military infrastructure that is vulnerable to climate change. An example would be CFB Gagetown, where recent exposure to repeated flooding has impacted regional military readiness and capacity. The Army, Navy, and Air Force are all currently undertaking extensive studies to assess the impact of climate change on their own activities in order to adapt and modernize their forces for the future operating environment. The Air Force and Navy are also conducting decarbonization studies to identify opportunities to reduce their emissions while preserving their operational effectiveness and interoperability with allies. This effort is being conducted in order to contribute to Canada's commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050. We're leveraging expertise at Defence Research and Development Canada, along with our partnerships with the private sector and academia to advance innovative solutions to the operational and security challenges posed by climate change. DRDC, for example, is looking at ways to reduce the energy requirements of deployed camps, as well as to maximize alternative and renewable fuel sources. One potential application of this is in the Arctic, where Northerners have very similar challenges to the Canadian Armed Forces when they're operating there. So research and development into clean energy solutions for the CAF when they're operating in the North can also contribute directly to Northern communities and meeting their intensive needs for energy as well. These efforts have become more recently supplemented with increased policy support that reaches into other areas of the intersection of climate change and security. So from a policy perspective, we've assessed four main categories of climate change as they relate to defense and security. Climate security, second, resilience and adaptation, greenhouse gas mitigation, and finally, operational capacity for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And as I've noted, efforts to adapt, build resilience, and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions are well underway. And we're taking a close look at operational capacity in the context of broader work to strengthen our approach to domestic defense. We've started to pull together efforts across the department to create an increasingly cohesive integration of climate change policy across national defense. Thanks to this effort, we've been able to share some early achievements and lessons learned with other government departments and seek out new opportunities for cooperation within Canada and abroad. And as I mentioned briefly at the outset, this is a relatively new area for the policy group at DND, but it's really certainly very clearly a growth area. We're already noticing that it comes up much more frequently on agendas for bilateral meetings, multilateral meetings within the defense and security community. Everyone is wondering what each other is doing to mitigate the impacts of climate change on their operations. There are lots of opportunities to share lessons, to collaborate on research and development, and to explore multi-layered implications of climate change for militaries. For example, President Biden has placed climate change and security at the center of his administration's foreign, defense, and national security policy. The United Kingdom recently published a strategy to adapt to climate change. And NATO Secretary General recently indicated that the alliance needs to step up and play a bigger role in combating climate change, including by reducing military emissions. So to wrap this up, the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces are acutely aware of the significant impacts of climate change on our work. There's clear urgency to continue and improve on our efforts to mitigate, adapt, and respond as our changing climate becomes increasingly relevant to defense. We're also seeking new fora that will enhance our understanding of climate change in defense while fostering communication about best policy practices, and we really welcome the contributions that events like this will make in that regard. That concludes my formal remarks, and I'd be really happy to answer any questions you might have following the next presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was great, and I'm sure we will indeed have some questions for you after we hear from David Harries. So, David, over to you now. And I understand you're going to be sharing your screen at some point.
First of all, very importantly, thank you for inviting me. When I heard that this was going to happen, I saw it as a huge learning opportunity for me. I do strategic foresight, and without many inputs, the foresight, the scanning I do is poor. Secondly, I wanted to hear my fellow panelists and what transpires in the question period. I use metaphors a lot, and I'm sure some of you have seen the movie Ford versus Ferrari, and that's the one I'm using today. Peace, order, and good government versus shock and awe. My plan, again, because of my commitment, great belief in foresight, is as follows: a little bit on context, a little bit on security, the status, literally globally, of climate change, and then the rest on our situation here in Canada. Context rules. There's been so much willful blindness, tunnel vision, selective hindsight, unnecessary ignorance, and policy-based evidence that has cost us in the last couple of decades that surely it is time to be more realistic. Context, we've got to remember, is plural for a country like Canada. It's what's happening inside, what's happening outside, but maybe most important of all, it's the competing biases, assumptions, and interests that every single individual has, whether it's on social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, ethical, or security issues. Context is being compressed everywhere. Accelerating change means more and more is happening every day. So the future is arriving faster and faster. More and more history is being created. Not just the history of today, but the history of the past that we didn't report, history that's being added, whether it's true or false. In my business, we're calling this the veracity wars. And countries' competence has fallen further behind what is necessary. And big reason for that is what I call fitness for purpose. This leads me to think that we have to think toes. Remember SWOT, business school, your business courses, companies? We have to start with the threats. We handle the threats well, there will be opportunities. The opportunities will allow us to identify the weaknesses we need to fix. And of course, if we have strengths, they should be the last thing we have to be worried about. Threats first also because there's a lot of unfinished geopolitical business. We're all aware that people want cultural autonomy, they want self-identity, they want reconciliation if there have been bad times in the past, self-determination, and of course, they want a passport. They want to be able to travel with their national passport. In 1985, in courses I gave in Austria, a professor, sadly passed away now, and I am unable to find where he made his estimate, said there were about 2,400 nations that were significant worldwide. In any case, many hundreds. Today, there are 193 of about 200 total states in the United Nations, and remembering that there were 51 at the beginning. Therefore, there are many hundreds of aspiring states, each and all in different circumstances, some with indigenous stresses, some at war, some with a debated status, some that are purely historically based, some with separatist issues, some internally at war, and of course, different forms of government. But as I see it, after about 1993, and the Cold War came down, the Cold War ended and the wall came down, and everybody dreamed of a peace dividend. And it took a few years before it realized that with the world returning to freeform, the peace dividend wasn't going to be great. And as I say, about, in my view, 1993, security became everybody's business. And now, better or worse, everybody's a security stakeholder, and more often than is now acknowledged, a security participant. Everybody. Security should be state security and human security. There was the heyday of the human security mandate protocol pressure in the 1990s. In fact, Canada had a foreign policy in the 1990s that was based on human security. You can relate parts of each of the two lists very easily. So let's get to the global security context. We have chronic threats and crises, and we have acute threats and crises. And that's simply a way that I do my analysis to allow me to at least briefly separate them for attention. In the chronic list, the nuclear issues, climate change, Jonathan just talked about in detail. One that is not talked about, but is implied again and again and again, there's a less and less amount of space per person. We've got rising population, we've got pollution, we've got climate change, we got rising seas, we got conflicts. There's less and less space for each of this increasing number of people to be safe, to live, to move, and to work. And the UN. I don't want to be overly critical. I've been a peacekeeper a number of times. I have good and bad memories, but I learned at a major briefing last Monday that the senior officials in Geneva truly believe that the UN has a security structure that cannot be changed. It can be added to. There can be adjustments, but it cannot be changed. And by that, I look specifically at the Security Council. Our acute threats and crises, the health, obviously, COVID-19, but mental illness and the increasingly inaccessible and unavailable nutrition for millions and millions of people. Cyber issues. We don't have a Geneva Convention on cyber warfare. So hacks, scams, extortion, lies are literally in a free-form position. There's the democracy recession. Freedom House says that it's getting worse and worse after 15 years of fading democracy, plus anti-government protests in many democracies. There's several conflicts underway, and there are two simmering that I believe are potentially much more consequential. One related to the Ukraine and one related to Taiwan. Climate change, shock and awe. Anyone who has experienced and lived through what is in these pictures doesn't need 1,000 words to describe their feelings, what they experienced. Shock and awe. And its causes and consequences, unfortunately, are reciprocally aided and abetted by causes and consequences of pollution, of the population increase, of the pandemic and other health issues, and inequality. When I was looking for inequality images, I found these car parks. These are both in the United States. They are cars lined up waiting at a food bank. Climate change, Canada? Well, the Ferrari's in the lead. And I believe in Canada. I've been all around the world and it's the best country in the world, but we have been so lucky, we do not do difficult times well. We hardly do any foresight. The Harper government, I was involved in a number of studies as offices in various departments for foresight were shut down, and we do little hindsight. Our infrastructure programs are behind what is needed. We're a country of differences. Diversity is good, but the diversity is now factionalized and polarized. And Canada's policy, regulation, and enforcement protocols are incomplete and infrequently deadly. The federal government, on taking office after the election before last, said Canada is back. But by every index that I could find, we're back in the pack. In the pack. The one that upsets me the most, that has caused me the most sorrow, is that we are number 7 in the group of 7 for taking care of our aged and elderly. Picture on the lower left is of Tuktoyaktuk. They obviously won't be living there much longer. Security context in Canada. It is fragmented, it is tattered, it's incomplete, it's in disarray. Nobody, I'm sure, today doesn't have some examples of the disarray in Parliament, in the Liberal Party, in the Conservative Party, in the NDP, in the Department of National Defence, in the Royal Canadian Military Police, in CISIS, in a number of provincial and municipal police forces, in procurement, fisheries, environment. For me, though, the most puzzling thing is how confused our whole issue of borders is. We have borders in the country and we have borders of the country. And it seems that the borders in the country are getting firmer and firmer, while even in a pandemic, our borders of the country are more and more porous. There are too many regulations, technologies, organizations, processes, and people that are fit for purpose in 2021. I don't know if any of you own a Honda, but one of my colleagues here in Kingston does, one of those Hondas that doesn't heat well. And it's been repaired a number of times and now it won't be repaired anymore. But what he learned was that the regulations for demisting and heating in vehicles in Canada was last rewritten in 1964. Now, the witnesses to the disarray, I'm not being judgmental, but I am being very honest, are the people I've listed at the bottom and my sick and unemployed friends and colleagues. All to say, the Ford needs parts and a major security tune-up. For me, the biggest problem is the Arctic. WP, wicked problem. ABNG, areas beyond national jurisdiction. For our whole existence as a country, haven't really had to worry much about the Arctic because it's been frozen, cold, a long way away. But as Jonathan pointed out in spades, that's changing faster, arguably, than anywhere else on Earth. So what for Canada now that climate change is thawing the Arctic Ocean into a new open sea? And I use this slide because when we're talking about doing things in the Arctic, being in the Arctic, providing for the Arctic, this is a fact. And I can, having worked in the Arctic, my unit built 4 airfields, Hudson Bay and North. It's difficult for many people to work in darkness for a long period of time. I can't help but ask, is Canada only a nearly Arctic nation? Trenton to Alert 4,000 air miles. Alert is at the top of that light gray spot. 4,000 miles, weekly resupply. Whitehorse, where we have one of our northern units, is 650 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. Yellowknife is 460 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. There are only 72 Canadian Forces members, about. I'll take any questions on the numbers, just what I Googled. And they're at Alert. The number of Canadian Forces north of the provincial boundary, 536. And I wanted a comparison point. So number of Canadian Forces in Latvia, Ukraine, and Iraq is 1,240. Have we got enough forces in the north? So here are my suggestions for a tune-up. We should fix the FERP, the Federal Emergency Response Plan. Right now it has 5 parts: prevention, response, recovery, and mitigation. But it should have added to it adaptation, communication, and resilience, but above all, foresight. And once that is done, we should install a National Emergency Management Agency. I was going to call it FEMA, but the US already has that. We need a peopled, at least a major secretariat that can allow the FERP, the Federal Emergency Response Plan, to be properly used by the 84 different emergency management organizations, federally, provincially, and municipally in Canada. I'd like to see a Minister of National Resilience. I think it's time. And it's time in another way. I learned again last Monday at the conference I referred to earlier that the United Nations is actively considering a global resilience institute, council, like the Global Human Rights Council, a Minister of National Resilience. I think if we've got a Minister of Middle-Class Prosperity, we should have a Minister of National Resilience. Install a Minister of National Learning and Literacy. I know, I've experienced myself how jealously the provinces hold on to their education situation. And I'm not going to compete, and I'm not intending to compete. But there's a lot of learning we can do about our own country and literacy, whether it's about climate, indigenous communities, infrastructure, that can be underpinned at the federal level. Minister of National Learning and Literacy. Jonathan mentioned President Biden's big document. Hidden in there, no, not hidden, but it's not very emphasized, is a climate change core, where he proposes all the benefits of having something like that. Now it goes back to Roosevelt's New Deal, but it's very interesting. And again, I can't say this loudly enough, address the new Arctic more realistically. Okay, I'm going to introduce and invite you to the Security and Sustainability Guide, a project of the World Academy of Art and Science. Security covers everything that we think about in security, and sustainability covers everything that you could possibly include in sustainability. The reason we started this 4 years ago was because we found many security organizations and many sustainability organizations weren't paying any attention to the other side of the fence. And it's only recently that a number of them have been created. Our purposes: we're trying to get people to connect, to network. We're trying to get organizations, very good organizations, to come out of their silos, or at least build doors and windows in their silos. The little graph at the bottom right, that's the exponential, and it's gotten even steeper recently, of the foundation of organizations dealing in sustainability. And today, the guide has a functioning website, a title index that names more than 2,000 organizations. And coming are mini packs, which are like blogs on contemporary issues, and a newsletter. And we, a 7-person international team, would really enjoy hearing from you. Thank you.
David, fantastic. Jonathan, why don't you come back on with your camera, and we will start taking people's questions. And if I could be so bold, I'd like to start a question of my own to Jonathan. And it was interesting because one or two of the suggestions that David made in terms of institutionalizing the resilience piece and the national planning piece ties a little bit into my question, and that was when you said that every government department is responsible for climate change in some way or another. But climate security, the climate security nexus, however, is a particular aspect of climate change. And I'm wondering, is there any consideration being given to the establishment of some kind of cross-departmental, cross-ministerial secretariat or task force, a la the Afghanistan task force, that would draw in people from the various ministries, because everybody has a different take on the issue and plays a different type of role. I'm just wondering, how does this become institutionalized, or is it sufficient to say, hey, let's everybody carry on and figure out how to do this on their own? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it at this stage, other than to say that I think, like is often the case in the government and in large bureaucracies, we're a bit slow to the starting line on this one, but certainly conversations have started happening As has been mentioned, it's such a wicked problem, and there are so many kind of intricately related aspects of this. Even if you narrow just specifically on the defense and security aspects of it, that I think it can seem a bit overwhelming. But conversations are happening. Partially, to be perfectly frank, because the same kinds of conversations are happening in the capitals of our closest allies. So we're increasingly asked questions on how we're dealing with these issues at home, which, I mean, we had started considering it, but I think it's on everyone's mind. We're turning our mind to it. I mean, I guess from a domestic perspective, at least, public safety kind of has an overall lead on emergency management and that sort of thing at the federal level. Whether or not that model makes sense and should be kind of expanded upon, or whether or not kind of a fundamentally new institution, as you're kind of suggesting, might be required, will be needed, I think is it's an interesting question, kind of a little bit outside of the leadership role for national defense, but certainly space that we're watching carefully. And I mean, I mentioned that the military is intended to be the force of last resort in responding to domestic and natural disasters, but we're often kind of the force of first choice. So we would certainly have kind of great interest in kind of a holistic look at how to do that better, how to kind of prepare provinces better, municipalities, the federal government, and how we can kind of improve our ability to come together in a rapid and meaningful way that reduces the requirements for the military to kind of come in and assist for anything but kind of the most serious cases. So it's a great question. I would say it's early stages yet, but I suspect that it will likely be under pretty active consideration in the near future.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it's obviously early days, but as David said, the train is moving, and we got to get on the train. David, I thought your presentation was quite intriguing in many respects, particularly the comment that you made in reference to Canada is back. In fact, the RCMI, one of its most recent speaker events, actually took that as a theme. And we had a professor, an academic from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, do a presentation on research polling that he had conducted with respect to what Canadians thought about Canadian foreign policy and what they wanted in Canadian foreign policy. And it was quite interesting to hear the results that really showed that Canada wants to be back. The citizens want Canada to do more and to be better and to be more active in many organizations, including NATO, for example. But that there was that sense that we weren't really there yet. With all of the threats that you have identified, the chronic threats and the active crises, where would you see the federal government putting its emphasis right now? How would you begin to prioritize those threats, given the fact that we now have COVID-19? We've just had a budget that is going to spend billions and billions of dollars over the next several years. How realistic is it, do you think, that the government is going to invest, for example, in the Arctic infrastructure that is so dearly needed?
The issue, cutting to the chase, it's all about priorities. And when I made my list, I recognized the fact that we're, 380 billion or whatever is the deficit this year, and it's still going to be big. So I tried to think of things that were affordable, all things considered. And I make no bones about it. I'm a massive proponent of Canada's Arctic being Canada's Arctic, not Arctic in Canada. The work and the amount of time I spent up there and the friends I still have up there, for me, it's personally embarrassing that we aren't more present in our Arctic. Now, I don't know how much that will cost, but I'm telling you that in the 1970s, we were much better prepared. We had an organization called the Construction Engineer Unit headquartered in Winnipeg, and it managed design projects all over the Arctic. And if you traveled up the Dempster Highway, there's the Eagle River Bridge that was built by engineers. There's 6 airfields. There's sewage things. There was housing. Plus, this will probably ring some bells the wrong way. We had an airborne regiment located in Edmonton that was responsible for the major air disaster plan, which meant we traveled all over the Arctic regularly to make sure we knew if we had to go somewhere serious, how much trouble it would be. We had airdroppable dozers, graders, and pulvomixes. That's knocking the air out of snow, so turning it hard. And we could do things all over the Arctic. We had a school for young people in Edmonton that we in the Airborne Regiment sort of sponsored on the Arctic. But of course, all that ended when politically the Airborne Regiment was moved to Petawawa, and no doubt about it, the decline began. So we have to take care of the Canada's Arctic, because if we don't, there are 3 or 4 others who are very, very active considering doing it. And we are so far behind Russia. Google Arctica, their double nuclear engine icebreaker that's brand new. It's an amazing thing. Now, one of the skeptics said, well, they don't need an icebreaker anymore. There isn't going to be any more ice. Well, that's flippant. I'm sorry. That's there will be ice. My priority is the Arctic.
Thank you. This is a question I think that either one of you or perhaps both of you could answer or address, and that is, we saw recently the Canadian Armed Forces respond to requests by the provinces of Quebec and Ontario to support the COVID crisis in long-term care facilities. And suddenly the Canadian Armed Forces, deployed many personnel into a number of locations and did a fantastic job. And this raised then a question about the essential purpose of the Canadian Armed Forces, whether or not there should be, for example, specialized training, whether we should be recruiting specialized personnel to deal with that kind of issue. So I guess the question really is if we take that as an example, is that kind of a response to natural disasters in Canada, given the frequency with which we seem to see these happening, whether it's floods, fires, droughts, whatever? Is this now an evolving role for the Canadian Armed Forces? Should it be, or should the government be looking at other agencies and institutions, even the private sector, to take the lead on some of this stuff? So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Jonathan, do you want to take that first?
Sure, thanks, Daniel. This is a little bit outside of my lane in terms of what I'm responsible for at National Defense, but I think I don't think, first of all, anyone would have ever predicted the role that the Canadian Armed Forces did play in the current pandemic. But at the same time, I think they'll always respond when called upon, and it's a remarkable institution. And I mean, I think it does kind of lead to some questions about how well we are prepared as a nation for these kinds of major shocks to the system that, I mean, the current one obviously is something that we haven't gone through before globally on the same scale, certainly in a very long time. So I think understandable in this case that that the government turned to the Canadian Armed Forces. They weren't alone. Certainly colleagues in other allied nations, they may not have been doing exactly the same things, but they were certainly contributing. Militaries were to COVID response, COVID mitigation efforts kind of around the world. So the question of whether they should be, I would personally offer probably not. But again, it is, I think, a question of one of the big lessons that hopefully we take out of this when we get through it, is that we do need to look at how we can be more resilient, how we can be better prepared for these kinds of kind of significant events, whether they be pandemics or other kinds of disasters. But yeah, and I'd like to directly answer your question. Canadian Armed Forces will always respond, but I don't think that in an ideal world we would design that kind of work as part of their role. I'll leave it there. And
okay, thanks, Jonathan. David, any quick comments? We're going to go to a break
Yeah,
shortly.
very briefly, I agree with Jonathan. It shouldn't be a role on the list of things that they come to work in the day and they see what they're going to do. But I ask the question, we have something called the Disaster Assistance Response Team, do we not? Still?
We do. Yep.
Yeah, can we not sort of use our imagination a bit and wonder if, I don't know, half of it or one of the secondary roles of the DART is DART-C, DART for Canada. And in many ways, that's what the forces did. And in the report they wrote, thank God somebody finally wrote that report. That's awesome. Made me personally, ex-military, very, very proud. But of course, we DND didn't get enough credit for it because it's DND and that isn't their job. But it is their job, because if the government asks them to respond to something serious, fine. But can't we think a little more about the DART? That's my comment.
Okay, thank you both. So that's wonderful. Now, just so you're clear, I know we haven't covered everybody's questions yet, but both David and Jonathan will be coming back at the very last of the very final Q&A session. So if we didn't get to your question, hopefully we'll have time to do it at that stage.